started, because I know you're not here to listen to me talk. No, you're too kind. I'm Dan Bartlett. I'm the curator of exhibits and education at the Logan Museum of Anthropology, and I'm also one of the co-conspirators of the Ecology's Passenger Pigeon project. And we're pleased to welcome you to the second in our series of events this fall on exploring extinction and history and passenger pigeons and environmental issues. We have a wide-ranging number of events, including our lecture series. And tonight we have Professor Stanley Temple with us. I want to remind you that we also have an exhibit running this semester at the Logan Museum of Anthropology titled "A Shadow Over the Earth, the Life and Death of the Passenger Pigeon," which looks at both kind of the biology and the passenger pigeon, a little bit about the history of its extinction, but then also takes kind of a Beloit and Rock County and state line centric view and looks at how the bird has been understood here in the state line region. Next Wednesday, our lecture series moves from this room to Richardson Auditorium when the History Department's 2014 Richardson lecturer Andrew Curley will be on campus to kind of take us from this kind of past into the present and talk a little bit about junkyard economies or how communities have taken to remaking kind of these abandoned industrial portions of their communities and found and repurposed them for new, for the new century. Part of this, the fun of putting this series together has been thinking about the different connections across campus that we've been able to make, taking a story of extinction that was immediate 100 years ago and kind of spinning it into looks for today. And part of that story is what is not the passenger pigeon story, but certainly the contemporary relevance is part of the economics department's Upton Forum this fall. And I'd like to introduce my colleague from economics, Warren Palmer, to tell us a little bit about what's happening with the Upton Forum this fall.
I'll pass these out if anyone would like to take one. This is a list of all of the public events that will be happening November 4th to 7th, as the economics department has the 7th Upton Forum, which this year will be on economic policy and the challenges of climate change. And Professor Robert N. Stavins of Harvard will be our Upton Scholar. And if you read articles about climate change that are in the New York Times, you'll see that they almost always will end up quoting him. He also was one of the lead co-authors of one of the recently released reports by the IPCC. And all together we'll be having 4 public events during that week. And we're delighted about the tie-in with the passenger pigeon.
Thank you. We are too, and it's been exciting, again, to think about the different disciplinary connections that you can take a bird that's been extinct for 100 years and have the opportunities to teach and learn across our campus. If you're keeping up with the events that are happening this fall, the Google search term you need to remember is ghost flock. If you Google ghost flock, you come to our website, and there's a nice big link that says events. And if you push that, the most current event will be on the top, including what's left in the lecture series here this fall, and on into the Upton Forum in November. So this is a semester-long exploration of these issues. But as I said, you're not here to listen to me talk. And I would like to welcome, the last thing before we go is that we'll have a chance for questions at the end of the session. And because we're live streaming the event tonight over the internet, we ask that our technicians will circulate a microphone through. If you could use the microphone, that's not for our benefit as much as it is for our internet audience benefit. But enough about the logistics of the event and the series. I'm delighted to welcome Stanley Temple, who is the Beers-Bascom Professor Emeritus in Conservation in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. For 32 years, he held the academic position once occupied by Aldo Leopold. He and his students have helped save many of the world's endangered species and the habitats on which they depend. He is currently the Senior Fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation. He has received major conservation awards from the Society for Conservation Biology, the Wildlife Society, and the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology. Among other recognitions of his achievements, he is a Fellow of the American Ornithologists Union, the Explorers Club, Wildlife Conservation Society, American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts, and Lectures. He has been president of the Society for Conservation Biology and chairman of the board of the Nature Conservancy in Wisconsin. Ladies and gentlemen, Stanley Temple.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that warm welcome. As you know, we are celebrating a sad anniversary in 2014. But 4 years ago, independently, a group of ornithologists and conservationists around the country were all coming to the conclusion that 2014 represented an incredible teachable moment about extinction. And we started making plans for taking advantage of that moment. And when we discovered that there were others thinking along the same lines, we joined forces and formed Project Passenger Pigeon, which has now been sort of in the lead of making sure that as many people as possible hear about the passenger pigeon story and understand its meaning for us today. So I have been very busy this year. I'm up to almost 80 lectures on the passenger pigeon this year. And one of the things that I've discovered, and one of the reasons that I've altered the title of my talk, is that I have discovered that most people have no idea what the passenger pigeon was, don't know the story, and really, at least until they hear it, aren't even sure that they want to know. I've discovered that even among professional conservationists, professional ornithologists, many of them sort of know the vague outline of the passenger pigeon story, but they really don't know the details of it. So we clearly have a lot of educating to do this year, and the title, Remembering a Lost Bird, sort of reflects the fact that so few people do remember. It has been a century. There's no living person who has seen a passenger pigeon in life. And after a century, we simply have forgotten and need to be reminded. This became very clear to me in the very first lecture that I gave this year, the first week in January at the Schlitz Audubon Center north of Milwaukee. And this is a common response from people who confuse carrier pigeon, messenger pigeon, homing pigeon, passenger pigeon. It all gets kind of jumbled up. But at the talk, an elderly woman arrived before the lecture and she said, "Professor Temple, I'm sorry, but I have to correct you. The passenger pigeon did not go extinct in 1914, and I have the proof right here in a shoebox." So when she opened the shoebox, there's a musty skeleton of a pigeon. And she said, "This passenger pigeon died in my grandfather's barn in 1924, and I can prove it because there's a dated band on its leg." Well, of course, it was a homing pigeon. So when I explained to her, of course, she was mortified because she and her family have been telling this story to everyone who would listen for 90 years. But this is not the same bird. The real passenger pigeon, a very different species, a very unique species, and to some extent, a spectacular species. It's not spectacular in its physical appearance. It's a sort of subtly beautiful bird. But what really made the passenger pigeon unique and truly spectacular was that everything that it did was done in almost unbelievable numbers. It was arguably one of the most, if not the most abundant bird in the world, certainly the most abundant bird in North America. And the estimates are that there were 3 to 5 billion passenger pigeons in the early 19th century. And I can say that, and 3 to 5 billion sort of floats right past. What does that mean? That's, of course, a lot of birds. If you sort of try to put that into perspective, at that time, 1 bird in every 4 in North America was a passenger pigeon. And if you put all of those passenger pigeons beak to tail and strung them out in a row, they could circle the Earth at the equator approximately 23 times. In other words, it's a lot of birds. And everything that they did was done, as I said, in these enormous flocks. When they wandered around during the year, they were in flocks. When they bred, they were in huge colonies. The bird is, as I said, evolutionarily unique in that it has been a distinct species for a long time. Its closest living relative is actually a bird that doesn't physically resemble the passenger pigeon very much at all. It's the bandtail pigeon of the western states. The geneticists assure us that they're 99.9% similar genetically, which is an interesting fact that I'll return to later in the lecture, because the bandtail pigeon may be about to play an interesting role in the ongoing saga of the passenger pigeon. So the passenger pigeon did go extinct 100 years ago, and obviously the birds were not subject to study by modern biologists. So what do we know about passenger pigeons? Much of what we know, of course, is based on historical records, observations that people made when they encountered these enormous flocks of passenger pigeons. And fortunately, it was such a spectacle that most people who witnessed it were moved to have something to say about it. And we go back all the way with the written records, all the way back to the very earliest explorers of the eastern seaboard. Champlain and Hudson and Cartier and Cabot weren't bird watchers, to be sure, but they all encountered these enormous flocks of pigeons and were moved to comment about them in their logs because they had never seen anything like this in Europe. But most of what we know about passenger pigeons comes from the observations that were made by 19th century explorers and naturalists and just ordinary citizens who encountered the birds. So, for example, Alexander Wilson, who's widely regarded as the first ornithologist in the United States, and that he's the first individual that pretty much devoted his entire life to studying birds, he had this to say, and it's an observation that many eyewitness accounts describe, and that is the birds settling into an area of forest and breaking off limbs, toppling entire trees with their weight. The flight of the birds, these enormous flocks through the forest, would defoliate the trees just with the physical damage from their wings. It was as though, as Aldo Leopold described it, a biological storm had passed through the forest. And indeed, many people described the forest as looking as though a tornado had passed through after the birds passed. Probably the most famous of the accounts comes from Audubon, John James Audubon. He was on a riverboat traveling down the Ohio River in 1831 when the boat crossed paths with an enormous flock of passenger pigeons. Well over 1 billion birds, probably close to 2 billion birds, flew over him and darkened the sky, as he says, for almost 3 days continuously. And these are accounts that many people describe, just the sudden appearance of these huge flocks, suddenly appearing out of nowhere, and suddenly the sky gets dark, it gets cool from the breeze created by their wings, it gets very noisy from the birds' wings, and it was really very frightening to some of the early settlers who had never seen such a spectacle. Most people sort of stop with Audubon's comments about the daylight, and they don't get on to the second part of it here about the pigeon poop. But you can imagine if 2 billion pigeons fly over you continuously for 3 days, there is pigeon poop to be contended with. And many of the accounts describe the passage of these large flocks as leaving the ground looking as though there had been a snowfall, sometimes with the guano accumulating to depths of several inches. So it really was a biological spectacle when these birds passed through. Right here in Wisconsin, John Muir, growing up on a pioneer farm near Portage, Wisconsin, had this to say, and his opening line here about it being a great memorable day was something that many people commented on. It was a great memorable day not only for the spectacle, because it meant for the day or two that the pigeons were passing, it meant delicious fresh meat on the table. And indeed, people have been exploiting pigeons for millennia. Native Americans hunted them, early settlers in the eastern half of the United States exploited them when they passed through their location. But they were never able to do much harm to the passenger pigeon. And the reason was that the pigeons were so unpredictable about when and where they were going to appear. So if you're a Native American camp or an early settler in the forest, suddenly you wake up one morning and the sky is dark with pigeons. And you've got a day or two while they pass to eat pigeon pie, and it's over. So there's only so many that could be killed by Native Americans or the early settlers, and they really had no significant impact on the pigeons at all. So we have all of these scattered eyewitness accounts of people who interacted with pigeons, especially during the 19th century, but they were scattered. No one had really attempted to bring all of these scattered eyewitness accounts together to really pull together the full story of the passenger pigeon. That is, until this fellow, Bill Shorger, a Wisconsinite, lived in Madison, a wealthy individual who retired in middle age and devoted the second half of his life to a passion that he had, which was digging through historical records to recreate the history of wildlife in early America. And if that was his passion, his obsession was the passenger pigeon. He literally spent 20 years of his life traveling around the country, visiting archives, libraries, museums, anywhere that historical records might be found. And back in the 1940s, of course, he didn't have the internet to search. He didn't even have copy machines. So he did it the old-fashioned way, page by page through newspapers, page by page through journals, until he found citations, descriptions of the passenger pigeon. And to his credit, he managed to amass over 9,000 eyewitness accounts of passenger pigeons. And he was able to integrate all of these observations to, for the first time, really tell the full story of the passenger pigeon. And he published it in this much awarded 1955 book on the passenger pigeon, which to this day stands as the definitive treatment of the passenger pigeon's biology. Almost anyone who talks about passenger pigeons in 2014 is relying on Bill Shorger's scholarship. It's somewhat a shame that his name doesn't get brought up more often, but basically what we know about passenger pigeons we largely owe to this guy's work. So we'll give him the last word with a painting by a Wisconsin artist, Owen Grommy, and I think Bill Shorger's right here, that the passenger pigeon was probably the most impressive species of bird that we've ever known. So what exactly did Bill Shorger find from all of these accounts? Well, one of the things that he could do largely for the first time was really plot out the geographic distribution of the birds. And he was able to show very clearly that they were largely associated with the eastern deciduous forest. They did range out into the fringes of the prairie. They did that in midsummer after the nesting season. But he was basically able to find accounts of passenger pigeons that sort of filled in the pink area on the map here. The one time, and within that range, the unique thing about passenger pigeons is that they were nomadic. They were more or less constantly on the move. And unlike many birds that have migratory routes, the passenger pigeons' movements were very unpredictable, so it was hard to know when and where they were likely to appear. And I'll explain in a moment why they adopted this sort of lifestyle. But it meant that if you lived in the eastern half of the United States in the 19th century, sooner or later you were going to have big flocks of passenger pigeons pass through your area. It wouldn't happen every year. It might be several years before you'd see them again, but just about everyone experienced the spectacle. The one time of year that passenger pigeons stayed still for any length of time was during the nesting season. And the nesting range, the breeding range, is shown in red here. And it's basically a band across the southern Great Lakes. And it's kind of interesting to speculate why that was their principal nesting area when they had the entire eastern deciduous forest that they could have nested in. And it turns out that that area where they nested corresponds pretty closely with what today we call the snow belt. It's basically where you get early, deep snows from the Great Lakes. And for passenger pigeons, that deep, early snow preserved the food that they would depend on the following spring. So all of the products, the nuts, the seeds, the fruits of forest trees got buried by snow there. And they weren't available till the next spring when the snow melted. In the rest of the eastern deciduous forest, all the other things that ate the products of forest trees had to go at it all winter, and the passenger pigeons wouldn't have had the bounty that was required for their large numbers. And of course, as you can see, Wisconsin features very prominently as a nesting site for the bird. But honestly, Bill Shorger didn't really need to do all this scholarship to plot out the geographic range of the passenger pigeon, because all he needed to do was pull out a gazetteer or a map. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of place names around the geographic range of the passenger pigeon that are named after a pigeon. And back then, the passenger pigeon was not called the passenger pigeon. It was simply called the pigeon or the wild pigeon. It wasn't named the passenger pigeon until the American Ornithologists Union decided to standardize the common names for American birds. So back then, all of these locations that have pigeon in their name, presumably, if you go back and trace the history, whoever the early settler was in that area was treated to a spectacular flight of passenger pigeons or a nesting colony of them, and was so impressed that they named whatever the feature happened to be after the pigeon. And indeed, you can pretty much plot out the geographic range of the passenger pigeon just by the places that are named after them. So the passenger pigeon was essentially a feature of life in the eastern half of North America. The birds were tied primarily to the eastern deciduous forest, and this beautiful painting of the birds really puts them in the proper ecological context, which was a large, unbroken deciduous forest. The birds are perched in an oak tree, and indeed, oak was one of their mainstays. It was actually acorns and beech nuts. Oaks and beech provided the mainstay for the pigeons. They fed on many, many other species of plants, but it was oak and beech that they really relied on, because these two species have the unique sort of feature of being masting trees, which means that they don't necessarily produce a lot of nuts every year. They produce them sort of sporadically, but when they do produce nuts, they produce them in sort of superabundance. And part of the reason, the strategy that the trees are using, is basically to swamp seed predators, to overwhelm them with the number of nuts that are produced. And passenger pigeons evolved or co-evolved with these trees as the principal seed predator. I noticed walking around campus today, this looks like it's going to be a pretty good mast year. You've got acorns all over the place, which would have been a bounty for passenger pigeons. But these two trees clearly provided the bulk of the food for the birds. When they settled in to nest, they were looking for a place where the oaks and beech from the previous fall had left this bounty of mast. They would settle in very, very quickly, build a very simple nest, lay their single egg, and get on with nesting very quickly. And when they nested, of course, it was done in these huge colonies of hundreds of millions of birds in some cases. And again, they were employing almost the same strategy that the oak trees were using against the pigeons. In this case, the pigeons were swamping their predators by being in a large flock. The local predators, which were mostly hawks and owls, could only kill a few birds while the pigeons passed. So by being in a large flock, if you're a pigeon, you minimize your individual risk of being killed, the same way that fish that occur in large schools reduce their individual risk, or mammals that occur in large herds. So it's interesting that both the trees that they fed on and the pigeons themselves were using very similar strategies. But the pigeons settled in very quickly. It would be the usual surprise. Suddenly, boom, there are pigeons. They've settled in, they nest, they start nesting quickly. And like many pigeons, they have an unusual way of raising their young that fits in with the food supply that they were relying on. They started nesting early when there was plenty of food on the ground, and they could fatten up their young squab to the point that it became obese. And by the time the nestling was sort of halfway through its growth period, the adults had pretty much cleaned up all of the mast within the sort of wide foraging range that they could cover. They were very strong flyers. So they would simply leave the squab to finish growing up on the accumulated fat, and when the young fledged, they would rejoin the flock. So this lifestyle worked spectacularly well for the passenger pigeon. Obviously, they could achieve this tremendous abundance. They were a very successful species, of course, until we arrived on the scene. And basically, things came completely undone for the passenger pigeon during the second half of the 19th century. And the pigeons at this period were the targets of almost unrelenting exploitation by people. Virtually every nesting attempt, the one time that they stood still, almost every nesting attempt was exploited by commercial market hunters, by just local people who would come in to kill pigeons. They killed the birds in just horrific numbers. And the disturbance that they created at the nesting colonies was often so great that the birds simply abandoned the colony. So very few young were raised. Some of the young starved because one or the other or both of their parents were killed, and in other cases they were simply abandoned. And the squabs, of course, themselves were also taken by the commercial hunters. Eventually, we had the capability of following the birds year-round, and the persecution continued 365 days a year. And it's pretty obvious, you don't need to be a population biologist to understand that if you're killing these birds on an industrial scale and you're interfering with their reproduction, we are engaging in what we refer to as overkill, killing a species faster than it can reproduce. And that is a mathematical equation for extinction. It is just a matter of time. And for the passenger pigeon, it really wasn't much time. It was a human lifetime. It was a few decades. So the pigeon's downfall was essentially a commercial exploitation that was carried out by thousands of people who were market hunters. In fact, among the market hunters, the specialists were the pigeoners. Pigeoners were people who show up in the US Census by the thousands during this period. Their profession was simply living with the pigeons 365 days a year, exploiting them wherever and whenever they could find them. And the reason they were doing this is that after the Civil War, there was a growing market for wild meat. And market hunters exploited almost any species that could be turned into meat, could be turned into fur or feathers or hide or whatever that could be sold at market. This is a scene from the market in Chicago, and if you're a good bird watcher or a good naturalist, I mean, you'll see most of the species of the Midwest that are good to eat or that could be sold for sale here. And as the population of humans grew, many of them being concentrated in larger cities, the demand for cheap meat grew very rapidly, and killing wild game and selling it commercially was very attractive. It was cheap. There was hardly any overhead involved. So you could sell things like pigeons literally for pennies each. So the market hunting period took place during this era in which the mindset of Americans was still this frontier mentality that the natural resources of the continent were inexhaustible, and certainly something as abundant as the passenger pigeon, no one could imagine that we could ever diminish their numbers. But the market hunters gained a tremendous technological advantage during this period that allowed them to become incredibly efficient at exploiting the birds. Two developments. The first was the telegraph system. This basically defeated the unpredictability of when and where the birds were going to appear. Once the telegraph system was in place, the birds could be tracked more or less continuously. And that meant that all of the thousands of pigeoners from throughout the eastern half of the continent could converge on where the pigeons were. And it greatly increased the rate at which they were going to exploit them. But they still had a problem. Even though they could be very efficient at finding the birds, they had no way of getting them to distant markets. So they would really only kill the birds to sell to very nearby local markets until the rail system expanded. And you can see somewhat perversely that the rail system expanded almost perfectly coincident with the passenger pigeon's nesting range. And that meant that the pigeoners suddenly had the ability to increase the kill, gut the birds, pluck them, put them in barrels of ice, and ship them off to distant markets. They were no longer limited to just local markets. And although this is a cartoon, it pretty much demonstrated what happened to most of the passenger pigeons during that period. They were packed in barrels of ice. 300 birds to a barrel was the standard. They were put on specially chartered trains that during the nesting season did nothing but go back and forth from the nesting area to the waiting markets in the large cities. And to make matters somewhat worse, the trains, of course, would be going back empty, so people from the big cities would hop on the train and go up to the nesting area, wherever it happened to be, to sort of join in the killing, more or less for recreation. So once the rail system was transporting these birds, for the first time we get some real quantitative estimates of how many birds were being killed, because of course the railroads kept track of the cargo that they were hauling. And there were some individual trains that carted off 1,000 barrels of passenger pigeons, 300 to a barrel. So, you know, the numbers are staggering as to how many were killed and shipped off to market. So right here in Wisconsin, right in the midst of all of this, in 1871, Wisconsin hosted the largest nesting of passenger pigeons ever recorded. The core nesting area covered 850 square miles of central Wisconsin. It basically ran from Black River Falls down to what today is Wisconsin Dells, up to Wisconsin Rapids. And all of the many, many descriptions of this nesting that Bill Shorger unearthed all describe virtually every tree held pigeon nests. It clearly involved many hundreds of millions of birds in this area. And we know from the railroad records and other records that Bill Shorger was able to amass that literally tens of millions of pigeons were killed and sent to market, let alone the ones that died and weren't collected and shipped off to market. And of course, because the disturbance was enormous, Bill Shorger estimated that perhaps as many as 100,000 people participated in some way in the killing during that one nesting season. So there was such a disturbance that very few young were raised. This was arguably a large portion of the pigeon population at the time that nested in Wisconsin. So Bill Shorger was, of course, particularly fascinated with this, and he did a particularly thorough job of unearthing all kinds of records. And I've just extracted a few here that give you some idea of the magnitude of what happened during that couple of months. They're talking about, shipping them off by the thousands of barrels. He estimates, as I said, that over 100,000 hunters, those would be several tens of thousands of professional hunters, as well as local people and people who came in by train to participate. And the one that caught my eye was from Sparta, Wisconsin. Sparta, Wisconsin at that time wasn't much more than a crossroads on the railroad. But it was very close to the lead mining area of Wisconsin, and there was an ammunition dealer there that made ammunition. And Bill Shorger found in his ledgers that during that 1871 nesting, this one gun dealer sold over 500,000 rounds of ammunition. And you can be sure all of those were fired at passenger pigeons. So the nesting season for passenger pigeons essentially became a killing field. And to make matters worse, with the telegraph system, the pigeoners could follow the birds year-round, so they just, wherever they went, the pigeoners were after them. And they quickly discovered that while the pigeons were being nomadic and wandering around extensively trying to find the place where there was an abundant crop of mast, they had a problem in that they couldn't kill them in huge numbers because it was very difficult to ship them off to distant markets when they were constantly on the move. So they quickly discovered that it was actually more profitable to catch the birds alive and sell them literally by the tens of thousands as live birds for target practice. It was very popular during the last part of the 19th century to have pigeon shoots. And at the time, these were big sporting events in which pigeons by the thousands were captured alive. When the pigeoners were in the area, they would supply these pigeons to the local shooters, and they would have these big competitions in which live passenger pigeons would be released for people to shoot at. And it was very profitable because these people were generally wealthy people who could pay for the birds. So the pigeoners devised these trapping techniques. They would eventually, they got very good at sort of predicting, you might say, where the pigeons were going to move in the next day or two. So they would sort of try to anticipate and move ahead of the birds. They would erect these enormous funnel-shaped nets that they would bait with acorns or corn or something. But in the center of the net, they would place some lure birds. And this photograph over here is one of the few photographs that exists of pigeoners. And these two guys, by their gear, are pigeon trappers. And here's in the circle is a wicker basket, and on the handle of the basket are perched two passenger pigeons. Those are their lure birds that they would place in the center of that net. The birds would be tethered so that they could make them move by pulling on a string so they'd flap their wings and draw the wild birds in. And in the pigeoners' parlance, these were called stool pigeons. And of course, we have incorporated that into our vocabulary today, meaning someone who betrays their companions. These pigeon shoots were enormous. As I said, they'd go through thousands or even 10,000s of birds at a crack. And obviously, once the pigeons ran out, they converted over to shooting at clay pigeons, which are the popular targets today. Again, linking our current vocabulary back to what was happening in the 19th century. So obviously this couldn't go on forever. And the end really came surprisingly quickly. The last big nesting was in Michigan. After that, the nesting colonies became much smaller in size, but all of them seemed to be located by the pigeoners, and they were all heavily exploited. The hunting, trapping continued more or less year-round, and virtually nothing was done to stop this. It's really amazing that the mindset of people at the time, they weren't thinking about conservation of natural resources. They weren't thinking about protecting wildlife. So even though people were clearly aware that something was going wrong with passenger pigeons, they weren't motivated to really do much. There were a few very ineffective efforts made toward the end when it was almost too late. But indeed, when you look at the 19th century, there were actually quite a few local and state laws that mention the passenger pigeon. But when you go back and read those laws, they were designed to protect the interests of the local pigeoners from the out-of-state pigeoners coming in to take advantage of the birds. They weren't concerned about the birds at all. So Bill Shorger's records are so complete that so far this year, in all the places that I've talked to within the pigeon's range, I've been able to pull up some of his records. And Rock County has a lot of them. And these are just a few of the observations, the ones that give you some idea of what people were being sort of aware of with passenger pigeons at the time. And of course, it talks mostly about killing the birds in these huge numbers. But eventually, by the later part of the 19th century, gone to other parts. Hunters, more numerous than pigeons, only a few small colonies. And finally, 1887, a few pigeons were reported. So even in the accounts of the day, there was evidence that people were roughly aware that something was going on. But what was going on eluded them because they had been quite accustomed for some time of this unpredictable nature of the passenger pigeon. They didn't show up every year. So it was no surprise, perhaps, when you went several years without seeing pigeons in your location. And the easy explanation was basically, they're somewhere else. And by the end of the 19th century, the ideas on where that somewhere else was were really fantastical. They had all flown off to Arizona. They'd flown off to Puget Sound. The most outlandish was Henry Ford, the Henry Ford, who was of the opinion that the passenger pigeons had drowned trying to fly across the Pacific Ocean, trying to reach Japan. No idea where he came up with that idea, but it clearly shows you that people, to some extent, were in denial, or they didn't really quite understand the magnitude of what was happening. It was easy to dismiss it as just part of what they were familiar with in terms of passenger pigeons. And indeed, until the very, very end, people remained in denial. My wife's family has lived in Wisconsin since the 19th century, and in the family's heirlooms was a 1902 cookbook that Jane's great-great-grandmother had contributed to. And a few years ago, Jane decided to dig out her great-great-grandmother's biscuit recipe for Thanksgiving dinner. So she hauled out this cookbook, and she was sitting in the living room reading it, and all of a sudden there was, and she said, "You're not going to believe this. 1902, there's a recipe for potted passenger pigeon," with a little footnote. They're getting hard to come by these days. Well, no kidding. The very last passenger pigeon was shot in 1902. There were none left. And indeed, right till the very bitter end, by the late 1890s and the turn of the century, there were no longer flocks of birds. They were, for the most part, individual birds wandering around the east, and invariably they were shot. By this time, people were aware of how rare they were, so they were shot generally to sell them to collectors, to museums, and many of them were taxidermy mounted. So the very last bird that anyone's been able to find any record of was shot in Indiana in 1902. The bird was extinct in the wild, and really the species at that point was only represented by captive birds, Martha, of course, being the famous last member of her species. Martha has an interesting history, one that is not generally well known. Martha was clearly a Wisconsin pigeon. When you go back and look at the records, she was owned by an aviculturist in Milwaukee who had a flock of passenger pigeons. He was notably successful at breeding them. It turns out passenger pigeons, like most pigeons, weren't all that difficult to breed in captivity. And in 1887, his records aren't totally clear, but in 1887, he had a young female. And almost certainly from the records, that was Martha. His name was Whitaker. He got tired of the birds and passed them on to another aviculturist in Chicago named Whitman. He didn't have much success with the birds. The size of the captive flock sort of dwindled, and eventually he got tired of the birds and shipped them off to the Cincinnati Zoo, where the last few survivors lived at the Cincinnati Zoo until it dwindled down to Martha. Martha was a rock star. By that time, it was well known that she was the last passenger pigeon. People literally came from around the world to visit her and see the last of this species that had once darkened the sky. Martha's death, of course, is one of those unusual instances in which we know to the hour when the species went extinct. She was 28 years old, wasn't looking all that well at noon when her keeper checked in on her. By 1 o'clock, when he came back, she was dead. Martha was immediately frozen in a big block of ice and shipped off to the Smithsonian Institution. Like all of the last wild pigeons and the other pigeons that survived in captivity, they were all trucked off to museums where they lie in state today. The sort of horrible reminder of the end of such a spectacular species. So the passenger pigeon's extinction was well marked. It attracted a great deal of media attention, and it was unquestionably a catalyst, a major catalyst for the emergence of the 20th century conservation movement. It was literally a wake-up call, a shock to the American public, because in 1914 there were lots of people alive who had seen the flocks of millions and billions of birds. So to realize that within their lifetime this abundant bird had disappeared was really kind of a shock. And as a result of all of the publicity of the death of Martha, people were motivated to want to do something. And unfortunately, what they did came way too late for the passenger pigeon. The first thing that was motivated by the passenger pigeon's extinction in the wild was the Lacey Act. John Lacey from Iowa introduced the bill that bears his name, and like almost all of the federal and state conservation laws and policies of that era, they invariably mentioned the passenger pigeon as part of the motivation for why they were doing this. So the Lacey Act was John Lacey's attempt to give the federal government the authority to regulate interstate commerce. And his idea was that if you could prevent the market hunters from transporting the killed wildlife across state lines, in Lacey's words, you would break the back of the market hunter by denying them the markets. But obviously it came too late for the passenger pigeon. It did come in time for a number of other species that were very much like the passenger pigeon, getting perilously close to extinction. The American bison, some of the plume-bearing birds that were killed for their feathers, were all candidates for extinction. And certainly the things that we did in the opening of the 20th century helped them. The Lacey Act, the creation, Teddy Roosevelt's creating the National Wildlife Refuge to protect the areas where birds congregated, and especially the Migratory Bird Treaty that for the first time provided protection for at least birds in North America. And it was blanket protection for all migratory species. So things happened very quickly, and no question it was motivated by the passenger pigeon. But it was all over in 1914, and all that was left was really to reflect on what we had done to this superabundant bird. And Wisconsin looms large in the passenger pigeon story for many reasons, not the least of which is that in 1947, the then young Wisconsin Society for Ornithology did something unprecedented. They erected a monument to the passenger pigeon at Wyalusing State Park. How many of you have visited Wyalusing State Park? A few of you. It's a beautiful location high on a bluff overlooking the confluence of the Wisconsin and Mississippi rivers. But they erected this monument, and it was recognized that this was the very first time that human beings had ever very publicly expressed grief for a species that they had pushed over the brink. And it's so recognized in the Guinness Book of World Records. The plaque, written by Bill Shorger, dedicates the monument to the last passenger pigeon shot, of course, in Wisconsin in September of 1899. Well, on the occasion of dedicating this tastefully simple monument, the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology published a little booklet called Silent Wings. And Silent Wings has become something of a classic in the passenger pigeon literature for two reasons. It was where Bill Shorger first published some of his information about the passenger pigeon. But more than that, it was also where Aldo Leopold was invited to write an essay on the passenger pigeon's extinction. The 1947 version is a pretty rare collector's item. This year, the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology has reprinted it, and you can get a copy from the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology. And as you can see, the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology actually, when they formed, they adopted the passenger pigeon as their logo and as the name of their journal. But what really made this event famous was Aldo Leopold's essay on a monument to the pigeon. It is arguably the most poignant essay ever written about human-caused extinction. And because he included it in the essays that formed his book, A Sand County Almanac, tens of millions of people have read this essay. And Leopold nails it. He says, "For one species to mourn the death of another is a new thing under the sun." It reflected a change in our attitude toward other species, that we regretted very publicly what we had done to another species. In his essay, though, he is very sort of predictive almost. After some nice words describing the passenger pigeon, eventually he gets down to the point of saying, "A few decades hence, only the oldest oaks will remember, and at long last, only the hills will know." Well, here we are, a few decades later, and what I told you in the introduction has come true. Most people don't know about the passenger pigeon story at all. Leopold goes on to express this, that there will always be pigeons in books and in museums, but these are effigies and images, dead to all hardships and to all delights. They live forever by not living at all. So there they are in Bill Shorger's books and in the museum trays. So most people today sort of scratch their heads and say, why didn't we do more to save the passenger pigeon? If we were aware that things were going wrong for them, why didn't we pull out a rescue attempt at the last minute? Especially since they were not that difficult to breed in captivity. Today, if a species got into trouble like that, there's no question we would do a captive breeding program. And it could have been done for the passenger pigeon, no question. But it wasn't what people were thinking about. People had passenger pigeons as a hobby. It wasn't a conservation strategy, and no one was interested in breeding them as a conservation practice. Instead, what they really were sort of fascinated with at the time was hybridizing passenger pigeons with other pigeons and doves. These are some photographs of the flock that Martha was part of, and we can't say for sure, but the date on the photograph suggests that that's probably Martha as a very fat squab. Martha, of course, the most famous of passenger pigeons. So some of you are undoubtedly aware that today there's talk about maybe giving the passenger pigeon a technological second chance. The de-extinction movement has suggested that perhaps using modern biotechnology, we might be able to resurrect the passenger pigeon and other extinct species. And the approach is what many of you are sort of familiar with from the book and the movie Jurassic Park, and that is using some pretty high-tech genetic manipulations to try to recreate an extinct species. In the passenger pigeon's case, it would involve the band-tailed pigeon. In this case, you would recover DNA from museum specimens of passenger pigeons. That DNA would be in absolutely terrible condition. It would be horribly fragmented and degraded. One geneticist said it would be like taking the New York City phone book and turning it into confetti. And then just for good measure, doing the same thing with the Boston phone book, mixing it all up and saying, here, read this. Well, it sounds impossible, but we have the technological capability of putting all these little fragments of DNA back together. You couldn't reconstruct the complete genome of the passenger pigeon, but you could put segments of it together. The band-tailed pigeon being the closest relative, you would find the analogous segments of DNA, and using genetic engineering, you would replace the band-tail segment with the passenger pigeon segment, creating a new genome that would neither be band-tailed pigeon or passenger pigeon, but some weird combination thereof. If you were, and that's very difficult, that whole process is very difficult, but if you were lucky, you might be able to get a stem cell that could be turned into eggs and sperm. You might be able to do in vitro fertilization and get an embryo, and if everything went according to plan, you would hatch a pigeon of some kind. Those of us who are somewhat skeptical have taken to describing this as a Franken-dove. It's going to be some weird, it's not a passenger pigeon, it's some weird combination of passenger pigeons and band-tailed pigeons. And who knows what that pigeon would be like as a living organism. I don't think we have to worry about flocks of passenger pigeons appearing anytime in our lifetime. These are really very low probability of success steps, and despite the optimism of the de-extinction crowd, they're going to keep trying, and they will pull this off eventually, but it is not going to produce a passenger pigeon. So at least for the time being, the passenger pigeon is gone. As it has been for over 3.5 billion years, extinction is forever, and we're not going to get these birds back. So all we can do is really learn from the lesson of the passenger pigeon. And the most direct lesson has to do with this dreadful capacity that we humans have to overkill other species, to kill them faster than they can reproduce. We've done it over and over and over again with species that we either desire because they're valuable to us, or in some cases with species that we despise because they are an annoyance to us. The passenger pigeon certainly wasn't the first bird in North America to go extinct because of overkill. The first was the great auk of the North Atlantic, a flightless bird that nested on just a few islands. It was very easy for sailors to come ashore and kill them during the nesting season. The Labrador duck, presumably as its name implies, it had life pretty comfortable up in Labrador where there were very few people, but it had the unfortunate habit of spending the winter in Long Island Sound, right next to New York City, where there was a thriving commercial market for waterfowl. So we wiped out the Labrador duck. Both of these species, of course, preceded the passenger pigeon, but they weren't known to most people. It wasn't a part of life for the eastern US the way the passenger pigeon was. The Carolina parakeet. Here's a case where hunting them, persecuting them as a pest contributed to their downfall, overkilling them because they were crop pests. The last species of bird to go extinct because of overkill presumably was the Eskimo curlew. It was hunted on bottlenecks in its migration movement and hasn't been reliably seen in almost 50 years. But the worst cases of overkill today that are ongoing are fisheries of the world. Overfishing is a problem that we just don't seem to be able to get over. Modern fisheries biologists know how to avoid doing this, but we seem to be incapable of restraining ourselves. And you don't have to go far to find examples of very valuable commercial fish that were overfished to extinction. The blue pike was arguably the most valuable commercial fisheries in the Great Lakes. They were fished to extinction. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and during the 1940s and 1950s, blue pike was what you ate at Friday night fish fries. I ate hundreds of them. So I contributed in some way to the demise of the blue pike. But closer to home, some of the ciscos and whitefish of Lake Michigan were similarly overfished. And it's as though we don't seem to be able to learn by the tragedies of these very valuable fisheries that were depleted by our greed. And indeed, today we still have examples of valuable fish that are being overfished toward extinction. The next slide shows 3 very valuable commercial fisheries that are essentially following the path of the passenger pigeon. And the music that I have chosen to accompany it, I like to think of as the anthem to overkill or overfishing. But notice the graphs and how similar they are to what happened to the passenger pigeon.
Back before the Second War, we could catch our fish in shore. Boats were small and gear was rough. We caught fish but left enough. And now there's no more fish because the trawler fleets took all there was. We could see it coming then. No more fish, no fishermen.
Shelley Posen's a Canadian folklorist. In fact, he's the curator of the Canadian Folklore Museum. He's also a talented musician. And by odd coincidence, Shelley Posen and I were both graduate students at the same time. He was in Newfoundland studying maritime Canadian folklore. I was up there studying birds, and we met at a campus bar where he was singing for his dinner. But we were there when the Grand Banks cod collapsed, and of course still has not recovered. The bluefin tuna, probably the most valuable commercial fisheries today. Some of you may have read that in the last few years, individual bluefin tuna have been selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars each for one fish for sushi. And indeed, when the news broke about these incredible prices being paid, Carl Safina, marine conservationist, immediately blogged. He said, "The fisherman who inevitably pulls the very last bluefin tuna from the ocean will be a multimillionaire overnight." And I think he's probably true. Certainly, these species are all following the path of the pigeon. And it's unforgivable in the 21st century because we know how to avoid this. You can maybe forgive people in the 19th century for not understanding, but you can't excuse the behavior today. Well, it's not all gloom and doom because the passenger pigeon's legacy did result in some great comeback stories of species that were very nearly extinct in 1900. These were all species that were commercially harvested. So trumpeter swans, wood ducks, plume-bearing birds, sandhill cranes and whooping cranes, and perhaps most notably the wild turkey. If we'd had the term endangered species back then, it's hard to believe today that wild turkeys would be considered endangered. They've obviously made a spectacular comeback and now are once again a valuable resource. Gray whale, Pacific gray whales have recovered to almost pre-whaling era numbers. Bison have come back from the few hundred animals that were at the Bronx Zoo to hundreds of thousands today. Beaver were gone over most of their range because they were trapped for their fur. They're back to the point where they're a nuisance today. And the Aleutian fur seals, one of the first real success stories back in the early 1900s, a bilateral agreement between Russia and the US curtailed the killing of the Aleutian fur seals, and their numbers increased spectacularly. Until recently, the last few decades, their numbers are starting to decline fairly steeply again. This time, it's not because we're overkilling seals, it's because we're overfishing the pollock, the fish on which the seals feed. We're basically starving them to death by overfishing. So there are these great comeback stories that indicate that we know how to avoid doing this, and we should be doing it more often. Unfortunately, when you look at the global endangered species list that continue to grow year after year, we're up to double-digit percentages of many of the taxonomic groups of organisms in the world that are considered by the IUCN to be threatened with extinction. And although the majority of these threatened species today are threatened by habitat loss, by invasive species affecting them, or by pollutants, including carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases, And climate change, unfortunately, there is still a substantial proportion of these that are still being overkilled. And indeed, just a couple of weeks ago, a paper was published in the Proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences pointing out that African elephants seem to be doomed. If we continue doing to them what we have been doing in recent times, they will be extinct essentially in this century. And of course, this is tragic because these are animals that are protected. This shouldn't be happening. We simply don't have the capacity or the willpower to really protect these species in the face of the enormous profits that can be made by killing them. But we should care, and we shouldn't be doing this. Overkill should be something that's part of our dark history. It shouldn't be part of the 21st century. And there are reasons why we shouldn't be doing it. There are the completely selfish reasons, the anthropocentric reasons. For many of these species that we're overkilling, they were valuable resources to us. They were species that we knew were valuable, and yet we drove them to extinction, depriving both current and future generations of the opportunity to use a very valuable natural resource if it was used sustainably. We also know, in a very selfish context, that we've learned over and over again, push a species over the brink, that extinction often has a way of coming back to bite us. And in the case of the passenger pigeon, that bite is very real. The epidemiologists have now put together a fairly convincing story that our current epidemic of Lyme disease traces its roots back to the passenger pigeon's extinction. They've now discovered that it's not a new disease in North America. They can find evidence of DNA going back as far as they have specimens to examine. So why did it explode in the mid-20th century? Well, the explanation is that passenger pigeons, of course, competed very successfully with other species for the products of the eastern deciduous forest. They were especially competitors of small rodents, white-footed mice and chipmunks, that are the principal reservoir for the Borrelia organism that causes Lyme disease. The passenger pigeons were so efficient at cleaning up these mast crops that the populations of rodents were never allowed to erupt in numbers. And rodents, of course, because they can reproduce very fast, when they're presented with an abundant food supply, they can increase their numbers very rapidly. So once the passenger pigeons were gone, the reservoirs for the disease to greatly increase in numbers, especially during mast years, providing the ticks that transmit the disease the opportunity to spread it to unwitting victims like people and deer and other animals that aren't really part of the life cycle. So in this case, we have suffered, sometimes very personally, from the passenger pigeon's extinction. There are also the altruistic reasons, the ones that Aldo Leopold was the great champion of, that it's simply unethical. It's immoral for us to push other species to extinction. And that idea has, of course, caught on and is now much more widely accepted. The other thing, again, by tragic example, is that when you cause one species to go extinct, it often has ripple effects throughout the entire ecosystem that that species was part of. And there's no question that the passenger pigeon's extinction, you can't simply remove one of the most abundant animals in the eastern forest ecosystem and not have an impact on the forest and the rest of the animals that live there. And we're just now starting to be able to unravel what the consequences from the passenger pigeon's extinction were. And one of the things that is now fairly clear was that the dominance of oak and beech in the forest today is basically the result of the passenger pigeon's extinction. Beech and oak were able to sort of assume dominance when passenger pigeons were no longer a major predator on their nuts. Of course, you all know the most abundant tree in the eastern deciduous forest was what? The chestnut. That was the dominant tree. Oaks and beech were minor. They were sort of secondary species, but we finished off, of course, the chestnut with chestnut blight, but when the chestnuts died off, there were several decades of oaks and beech after the passenger pigeon's extinction were ready to move up and take over the canopy. We've had an interesting sort of interest by forest ecologists in trying to link the passenger pigeon story to what they understand about the history of the eastern deciduous forest. And I gave a talk down in North Carolina, and a forest ecologist he's a dendrochronologist, he studies tree borings, growth rings on trees, and he has one of the longest records for the eastern US. He got permission to do increment borings on the trees around Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's home. And more than that, they gave him permission to do borings of the big timbers that were used to construct the buildings there. So he has a complete tree ring record that goes all the way back to the late 1400s. And they've been able to examine that, and they've been able to show, not surprisingly, that it lines up with Thomas Jefferson's meticulous climatological records. When there was a wet year, the growth rings were bigger than when there was a dry year. But he said, we've always had these weird anomalies in the growth rings that we could never really quite understand. And he said they were similar anomalies. These were very small saplings that would have clearly been in the understory of the forest. And they were growing very, very slowly, just putting on very, very tiny little growth rings each year. And suddenly, these little trees would put on this enormous burst of growth, big growth rings, for about 2 years. And then it would go back to tiny little growth rings again. And when you think about what happens with saplings in the understory of the forest, they're waiting there for sunlight, for something to open the canopy. And is it possible that the passenger pigeons might have had this effect of defoliating the canopy, opening it up, and for a brief time allowing sunlight in? And furthermore, of course, they deposited abundant fertilizer on the site. So he was very interested. He said, could you go back to Bill Shorger's records and see whether there are any evidence of passenger pigeons roosting in the area near Monticello? Bingo. There was a big roost there that would have perhaps contributed to this phenomenon. So we have lots of evidence, of course, mounting evidence of the importance of the pigeon in the ecosystem. So obviously, this shouldn't be happening to other species, what happened to the passenger pigeon. In the 21st century, we should just simply put some forms of stupid overkill behind us. We shouldn't be killing elephants for ivory. We shouldn't be killing rhinos for their horns. We shouldn't be killing tigers for their parts. We shouldn't be whacking fins off of tens of millions of sharks every year to make shark fin soup. Those are just stupid things to be doing, and we shouldn't be doing that. Almost every form of exploitation of wildlife can be made sustainable. We know how to do this. There's a science behind it now. So it's inexcusable when we actually do overkill a species. We know that endangered species, the species that have gotten into trouble, they need more protection, not less. And yet right now, as you sit here, there are 4 bills in Congress, 2 of which would pretty much outright repeal the Endangered Species Act, and 2 that would very significantly weaken it. And indeed, every year since 1973, when we passed the Endangered Species Act and were the first nation in the world to make a national pledge to preventing extinctions in our country, every year special interest groups have been attacking the Endangered Species Act because endangered species get in our way. They prevent us from doing developments. So this is a pivotal year. The Endangered Species Act could be endangered this year. The fall elections may hold the fate of the Endangered Species Act. Existing protections. Most countries around the world do have nominal protection for species, but we seem not to be able to actually pull it off. Rhinos and elephants are protected. It's just impossible to muster the resources to protect them in the face of the lucrative market for them. One good thing happened this year. In February, 29 nations of the world got together in London and signed an international agreement that they would elevate illegal wildlife trafficking to the highest form of felony in the countries, which for the first time really elevates illegal trading in wildlife products to being more than just a slap on the wrist and a sort of a cost of doing business. So this year, Project Passenger Pigeon is trying to tell the story, explain the lessons, and get it out to as many people as possible. And in the process of trying to reach as many audiences as possible, we've tried to be very diverse in the ways that we're telling the story. Probably the one that will get the message out to the largest audiences is David Mrazek's film, which you'll be seeing in a while here. It'll be showing on public television all this fall. Joel Greenberg, who you'll be hearing from on campus, wrote a very good book. There are other authors that have written books in 2014 for all sort of age groups. Artists in particular have sort of caught on to the Passenger Pigeon Centennial in a big way, and I do mean big. Todd McGrain of Cornell University and his Lost Bird Project. He produces these incredible, huge sculptures of extinct birds and places them out in locations where the birds used to occur. In Cincinnati, John Ruthven, a famous bird artist in his late 80s, created this huge mural. Those birds are anywhere from 10 to 15 feet long. It's a very large mural. It depicts Martha leading a flock of passenger pigeons out of the cage that she once lived in, which still exists at the Cincinnati Zoo as a sort of a memorial to the bird. Up in Wausau, Wisconsin, the annual Birds in Art exhibit, big international show of bird artists, the Lee Aukie Woodson Museum this year is devoting the exhibition to extinct and endangered birds and using the passenger pigeon as the central organizing theme. And in probably the strangest way of getting the message out, we discovered that the first symphony ever written in the United States was inspired by the passenger pigeon. It was written by this fellow, Anthony Philip Heinrich. He was a European immigrant who came to the US in the early 19th century to experience the American wilderness. And he happened to be on the boat with John James Audubon in 1831 when that enormous flock of passenger pigeons flew over the Ohio River. And he was so moved by this that he composed a symphony. He went on to some fame. He was one of the founders of the New York Philharmonic, but his passenger pigeon symphony has been performed once in the world, in 1858 in Prague. It's never been performed in the US. It will be performed this year, not far away. The UW Symphony Orchestra in Madison is going to be performing the symphony on November 2nd. And we thought it was going to be the US premiere until we encountered a little bit of intercollegiate rivalry. The Yale University Symphony Orchestra changed their fall schedule so that they could perform it a week earlier. But ours will be better. So nobody knows what this symphony sounds like, but it had a choral accompaniment arrangement, and we did have a pianist sit down and play the piano accompaniment to the choral arrangement. It's sort of somber in places. It gets very exuberant when 2 billion passenger pigeons fly overhead. But it's described as being very typical 19th century music. But just today in the news was what I think is the most clever way of commemorating the passenger pigeon's extinction. This farmer in Pennsylvania who owns Pigeon Roost Farm created a corn maze with a passenger pigeon on it. Very clever. And I made my own, I think, clever contribution to the 2014 commemoration by trying to target the citizens of Wisconsin with what I know is a tremendous attraction for them, a good beer. So the Capitol Brewery in Middleton, Wisconsin, last Thursday released Passenger Pigeon India Pale Ale. It attracted a very large crowd, the largest crowd that they've ever had for the launch of a new beer. Several hundred people came to drink to the memory of a lost bird. The souvenir glasses sold out. The people were hauling away the beer by the case, demonstrating something about Wisconsinites. Project Passenger Pigeon, though, is the source to go to for everything you've ever wanted to know about passenger pigeons, and obviously we're doing our best to take advantage of this very teachable moment. So thank you, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. And if you raise your hand, there'll be a microphone coming your way.
You mentioned the reliance on nut masts, but since that's seasonal and it's primarily to the north, but the range is so extensive, what were some of the other resources that they relied on, and was it an economic hardship for agriculture?
They relied on just about any plant, fruit, seed, nut that they could exploit. And they were very good at it. This habit of wandering around trying to find where there was a local abundance. So the list of things that they ate that Bill Sugar put together, it's almost 200 species of plants. But in the late 19th century, when I said that pigeons after the nesting season would move out into the prairies, this was a bird that was sort of programmed to wander around the landscape, finding locally rich patches of food that by the late 19th century meant wheat and corn. So the accounts of Iowa, Minnesota wheat farmers, for the most part, are tragic for the farmers, but very telling that they would wake up one morning, there'd be this distant cloud on the horizon, and within minutes, their wheat field would be gone as 1 million passenger pigeons settled in. So indeed, they were a major threat to agriculture, and people often killed them, like they did the Carolina parakeets, to defend their crops. They resorted to all kinds of devious ways of killing the birds to protect the crops. But it sort of raises the issue, as Aldo Leopold did in his essay, when he said if the pigeoners hadn't finished the birds off, farmers would be obliged to in self-defense. And when you think about the idea of bringing back the passenger pigeon and putting it back into the eastern U.S. today, they would be a major threat to agriculture. We probably wouldn't tolerate them, certainly not in anything like the numbers that they existed in previously.
Martha died at 28. What's the natural lifespan, do we think?
You know, no one banded the birds and studied them, but for most birds, of course, the average lifespan is only a fraction of the longevity record. Martha would have been the longevity record for a passenger pigeon. My guess is when we've done population modeling and sort of tried to figure out what a balanced passenger pigeon population might have looked like, the average passenger pigeon probably only lived 3 or 4 years.
This is just a question of clarification, but I was unsure of how the telegraph system contributed to the decline of the population.
Well, if you imagine there were these tens of thousands of people who were professional hunters, and they lived somewhere in the eastern U.S. And prior to the telegraph system, they could only really locate and exploit the birds that happened to come through their part of the eastern U.S. But when the telegraph system was in place, it was like the social media of the day. The pigeoners could all contact one another and say, the pigeons are in Wisconsin this year, or the pigeons are in Michigan this year. And all of these thousands of hunters would hop on the train and converge on the place. So it meant that you transformed the killing of the pigeons from being a few local hunters who were killing birds for essentially the local market. You transformed it into thousands of hunters descending, especially on the nesting colonies, and being able to kill the birds, as I said, on an industrial scale to ship them off to very distant markets. But without the telegraph system, the pigeons' unpredictable nomadic wanderings made it very difficult for the pigeoners to know when and where to exploit the pigeons. Way in the back.
I've heard that the Cincinnati Zoo had a plan to bring back the pigeons, you know, with Martha and George.
George, her husband, yeah.
Yeah.
George and Martha Washington were named.
Well, I was just wondering why the plan failed. I've heard that George was around for a couple of years, so I mean, does anyone know why it failed?
You know, yes. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. By that time, both George and Martha were pretty old and probably past their reproductive prime. And furthermore, the Cincinnati Zoo was not a conservation institution. They were interested in attracting visitors. So they really didn't put any major effort into continuing a captive breeding effort. And it really was kind of tragic, as I said, because aviculturists had bred the birds. I mean, today, if this had happened, we could have easily rescued the bird. But no one was thinking that way at the time. It just never dawned on someone that it would be possible to do that. Really, the first species for which we sort of pulled it out with captive breeding was the American bison. There was a herd of a couple of hundred animals that William Hornaday had assembled of all places at the Bronx Zoo. And every bison alive today traces its ancestry back to those few hundred animals that were bred at the Bronx Zoo. So that was the earliest success, you might say, at using captive breeding as a strategy for rescuing a species that might have otherwise gone extinct.
Hi. You said there wasn't any attempts to help conserve the pigeons when they were becoming endangered. Do you think that's because they didn't know how, or because they really had no interest in doing so? Because I find it hard to believe that such a developed civilization really didn't think they were have any consequences to getting rid of all the pigeons.
I know, it's very hard to put yourself in the mindset of people of the 19th century. They were confronted with this enormous wealth of resources in North America, and it was just unimaginable to them that they were going to exhaust these resources. So no one was thinking about conservation. There were a few voices that were raised about the passenger pigeon. Audubon himself did, James Fenimore Cooper, the author, did, a number of notable people who essentially had the ear of people, sort of raised the alarm, but it was not sort of in the direction of thinking about conservation. It was, oh, how dreadful what we're doing to the passenger pigeon. It was mostly about the horrific nature of the slaughter that was happening. And at the time, they were calling for simply not disturbing the birds at the nesting colonies, which, if they'd been able to get people's attention and did that, well, that might have made a big difference. It certainly would have prolonged the species. But it wouldn't probably, have worked unless we backed it up with what today we think of as wildlife conservation professionals who are out there enforcing regulations and making sure that people behave according to the rules. None of that existed in the 19th century. So you could say, as Michigan tried to do, that we're not going to bother pigeons when they're nesting. Well, that was just a total bust. It was on paper only. People continued to do what they had done for decades. So it was pretty sad that we really didn't do anything very significant to prevent the birds from going extinct, whether it was in captivity or in the wild. And the birds were, they were on a collision course, essentially. Because not only were we becoming very effective at killing them, but at the same time that we were slaughtering the birds, we were cutting down the eastern forest. So although we never cut down enough of the eastern forest that we would have caused their extinction just because we were destroying large areas of forest, because the remaining big patches of forest where the pigeons would obviously go to find food, it was known where those places were. So it made life much easier for the pigeoners, because after the pigeons, say, left Wisconsin, the pigeoners could be fairly confident they were headed for the Ozarks, because that was the next big patch of forest that would produce the hardwood nuts and so on that the pigeons were after. So ironically, the deforestation, the cutting of the forest, it certainly would have reduced the pigeon population. But the only way that it really contributed directly to the extinction was essentially making life easier for the pigeoners and more difficult for the pigeons.
Other than the DNA possibilities for de-extinction, can you think of other kinds of values that the existing museum collections of pigeon skins might have?
Well, certainly, I mean, we've always discovered that those skins in museums, you know, sort of have a way of providing additional sources of information about species. So just within the last couple of months, a team of geneticists did publish most of the genome of the passenger pigeon. So that will undoubtedly keep them going for a while, analyzing that genome and trying to figure out several things about it. And the paper that they published was really quite interesting because even from 5 specimens that they used for reconstructing the genome, they were able already to infer some pretty interesting things about the passenger pigeon. They found far less genetic diversity than they would expect for a population of billions. And the inference was that passenger pigeons at some point in the past had apparently passed through some type of a population bottleneck and had lost a lot of their genetic diversity. The logical explanation for this was the Pleistocene, when a lot of the passenger pigeons' range shrunk because of the climate change. But some of you may have read a very popular book in the last few years, Charles Mann's book, 1491, The World Before Columbus. And Charles Mann, he's a great storyteller. He really puts together a good story, and a lot of his stories are based on a premise. And if the premise isn't quite right, the rest of the house of cards doesn't fare very well. So his story about the passenger pigeon, which actually relates to your previous speaker about the archaeological evidence, his premise was there are not that many pigeon bones in Native American middens. But then he goes on to say, therefore, there must not have been many pigeons around. And it must have been because Native Americans were so efficient at hunting the birds that they kept their numbers down. And it was only after we, Europeans, decimated the Native American populations that passenger pigeons suddenly exploded in numbers and reached these sort of superabundant levels. Well, the whole thing falls apart just on the historical record. As I said, the earliest explorers of the Atlantic coast talked about these huge flocks of pigeons before the Native American populations were decimated. And furthermore, as I described, if you're a Native American camp, you know, you don't know that suddenly the next day these pigeons are going to appear. You've got a very short period of time to eat pigeons. You have no way of preserving them. So you really would have eaten pigeon for a few days and thrown the bones on the midden, but it wouldn't have been in enormous numbers. So unfortunately, these geneticists kind of latched on to Charles Mann and said, aha, the bottleneck must have been Native Americans hunting the birds, and they've increased their numbers when there'll be a lot of letters written saying, nah, remember the Pleistocene, that was probably more likely. But the other thing that this genetic analysis revealed is that even if they had passed through a bottleneck at some time in the past, the fact that they retained this low genetic diversity suggests very strongly that this was essentially one big pan-mictic population. There was no subdivision, there was no eastern population, western population, that these birds were just one big population of pigeons that wandered all over their geographic range.
We'll take one more question across the way here. You've been waiting for your hand up. And then I'd like to invite everyone to a reception, some refreshments in the lobby or the atrium of the Science Center. Join us for a little bit of continuing conversation.
You've kind of addressed this in your presentation and that last question, but do we have a geologic record of other large, like infestation, like populations of species in the like North American history, or anything like the passenger pigeon?
Yeah, we do have some spectacular, but not quite as spectacular as the passenger pigeon, examples of these species that occur in superabundance. The one that everyone will be familiar with is the biblical swarm of locusts. So those locusts, very similar to passenger pigeons, sort of unpredictable in the past at least as to when and where they would appear. But there are other birds that occur in very large flocks. A couple of them are actually pigeons. Eared doves in South America occur in very large flocks. And today, actually, they are the targets of recreational hunting. Hunters from all over the world will go down to Argentina and be set up to basically shoot eared doves until they can't hold on to their guns anymore because it's gotten too hot. There's the stock doves and budgerigars in Australia that occur in these very large flocks. In Africa, there's the quelea bird, a small finch-like bird. That all of these species are very much like the passenger pigeon in that they've adopted a life strategy that involves wandering around finding locally rich patches of food in these large flocks. So there are other examples, but none quite as extreme as the passenger pigeon. And indeed, you know, we've learned over and over again that this lifestyle is very risky if people decide to kill you. Because by concentrating large numbers of individuals in one spot, it makes it very easy for people to really, you know, up the kill quite a bit. So if you remember the great auk, the fact that the entire population in the North Atlantic nested on just a few islands meant that there were thousands and thousands of birds packed in to these islands where they could easily be killed during the nesting season. Probably the most recent example of this, a species that my students and I study, is a little finch-like bird called the dickcissel. And dickcissels occur in the grasslands of North America. They fly down to a very, very small restricted area in central Venezuela for the winter. And the entire world population from across the grasslands of North America spends the winter in literally a handful of multi-million bird flocks. Sort of reminiscent of the passenger pigeon, only several orders of magnitude smaller. Well, the farmers in this area of central Venezuela got very nervous about their rice and sorghum crops when they saw flocks of 1 million dickcissels flying around the neighborhood. And they decided to do something very illegal, very surreptitiously. They recognized that these birds, like passenger pigeons, would pack densely into nocturnal roosts. So they would load up their crop dusters with deadly organophosphate pesticides, and they would spray the roosts. And since there's only a handful of these roosts in existence, they were capable essentially of knocking out double-digit percentages of the world's population literally in minutes. The descriptions are that, you know, the fields where they roosted would be knee-deep in dead dickcissels. And the dickcissel was declining toward extinction. In fact, in the 1980s, many ornithologists and conservationists predicted with great confidence that the bird would be extinct by 2000. That's how steep the trajectory was. So when we figured out what the problem was, that it was farmers in Venezuela killing the birds, and when we were able to show the farmers that despite the fact that, you know, these big flocks of birds looked pretty menacing, they really weren't doing any significant damage to their crops, we were able to use some peer pressure with other farmers who really felt kind of bad about this to get the farmers to stop doing this. In exchange, the Venezuelan government, conservation community said, will you give up killing the birds illegally and surreptitiously and threatening the birds, really, if we agree to stabilize the population at about 10 to 12 million birds? Everybody signed the deal, and within a year, the population was stabilized at 10 to 12 million and has been right there level ever since. No longer endangered. It took 1 year to basically overcome overkill.
And let's leave on that kind of hopeful message. Thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Professor Temple.
You're very welcome.